our next storyteller of the night. Scott was 17 years old, sitting in the back of a New York City taxi cab with Joan Baez, Dennis Hopper, and Phil Ochs. Phil Ochs. When all of a sudden, with a simple twist of fate, Bob Dylan sprawled across his lap, looked him directly in the eye, and asked a very personal question. Please welcome Scott Sanders with me and Bob Dylan sitting in a tree.
Hi. I'm just feeling nostalgic. I don't usually wear a New York hat, and I put it on today. I'm from New York. And I think I am an acquired taste. Anyway, I think I have apophenia, which is the illusion of meaningfulness in unrelated events. But strange things happen to me. I've been struck by lightning. I was kidnapped in China. The song "You Light Up My Life" was written for the woman who had just left me. I was Lou Reed for 1 week in LA, and I used to be an actor, and I was on the David Letterman show, not for me as an actor, not for stupid pep tricks, but to introduce my dog, who was an emerging dog star. Subsequently, I had therapy because I had canine rivalry, but that's a whole other story. I left New York City on April 14, 1996, which is 150 years to the exact day that the Donner Party left on their voyage to California. My Conestoga wagon was a 24-foot Hertz frontal truck. Like the Donner Party, I waited until spring to avoid bad weather, and I hit snow in every single state. Like the Donner Party, I followed the California Trail, and like the Donner Party, my trip stalled in the Sierra Nevada. When I was sitting on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, I imagined that the gap-toothed people staring at me might be descendants of the Donner Party. I've traveled to all sorts of places in the world, and I've experienced stares that made me feel endangered or privileged. These were the first stares that made me feel delicious. Bing, bada, bing. Anyway, I prevailed and I staked my claim in Oakland, California, and I sort of got sidetracked. Back this story is I'm 17 years old, and I grew up in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and on the one side of the tracks was Saturday Night Fever, and on the other side of the tracks were the mafioso Godfathers. And I grew up in a very secular Jewish family, and my parents, they weren't like commies, but they were leaning that way. They were sort of Bernie Sanders more than socialists. And every summer they sent my sister and I to a socialist sleepaway camp where instead of water skiing on a lake, we would visit migrant farm worker camps. And all the counselors were ex-Freedom Riders or Weather Underground members. And the music that we liked was Pete Seeger and Joan Baez and the whole anti-Vietnam War music of Phil Ochs. And of course, Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan was God. Don't follow leaders, watch your parking meters. It doesn't take a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. And weatherman was the takeoff for Abby Hoffman forming the Weather Underground. Do people know who Abby Hoffman is? Yes. Abby Hoffman was the leader of the anti-war movement. He was part of the Chicago 7. And so when I was 17, I was working part-time at a daycare center in the village, and Abby Hoffman's son, America, who was 3 or 4 years old, went there. So I got to know Abby Hoffman. And in 1974, the government had sort of trumped up charges against Abby Hoffman, and he got scared and he went underground. And his wife, Anita, asked me if I'd babysit for America, 5 days a week from 3 to 6, and I was thrilled. Because in those days, babysitting for Abby Hoffman's kid was like babysitting for Johnny Yoko. It was a big deal. And Abby's wife, Anita, was 32, and I sort of had a crush on Anita Hoffman. So she invited me to go to a Bob Dylan concert. So I was thrilled because she invited me, and also because it was Bob Dylan. It was a benefit concert for, there was an assassinated, democratically elected president of Chile called Salvador Allende. The CIA and Kissinger had orchestrated his demise. But another legendary folk singer, Phil Ochs, had organized this concert. And Phil Ochs, as a side note, in the 1960s, when he came to New York, he said he wanted to be the best folk singer in New York City. And then he met Bob Dylan, and he said he wanted to be the second best folk singer in New York City. So Phil Ochs organized this concert, and there was Joan Baez and Dennis Wilson and the Beach Boys and Arlo Guthrie and Tom Rush and Dave Van Ronk and Patrick Scott. And the concert was great. I was thrilled to be there. And because I was with Anita Hoffman, we were escorted backstage. And I had been a huge Dylan groupie from the time I was conscious. And here I was watching Bob Dylan, and he was totally humiliating this young guy in his band who, I mean, he was totally, you know, unsympathetically just riding him. And I looked around, and there was Joan Baez and Phil Ochs and Dave Van Ronk and the Beach Boys, and they're all laughing as if it was funny. And even as a 17-year-old, I realized it's got to be hard to be Bob Dylan if you never get an honest response from anybody. Anyway, it's after the concert. Phil Ochs invites everybody to his, he has an apartment on Central Park West for an after-concert party. And Bob, I feel like I'm on a first-name basis with Bob, says he wants to take the subway. Now, Dennis Hopper was there. People know who Dennis Hopper is?
Yeah.
Okay, the connection between Bob Dylan and Dennis Hopper, Easy Rider had recently come out, and a couple of Dylan songs from Easy Rider, so I guess they became friends. So when Dylan announces that he wants to take the subway there, Dennis Hopper gets right in his face and says, Bob, says, yo, Bob, you know you're Bob Dylan, right? And Dylan sort of nods. Bob Dylan can't take the subway in New York City. So we go through the bowels, this labyrinth of tunnels under Madison Square Garden, and we end up on the 8th Avenue side on the sidewalk. And the second we hit the sidewalk, the deranged fan runs up to Dylan, grabs the cowboy hat, off his head, and starts running away. Now, I don't know if Dennis Hopper, was a jock or whatever, because he turned into a defensive lineman, and he made a flying tackle at this fan, and he got the cowboy hat back. Finally, we get to the sidewalk, and somebody in the entourage hails a cab, and I find myself in the back of one of those old New York City yellow checker taxi cabs, and Joan Baez is on my left, I'm in the middle, Phil Ochs is on my right, and Dennis Hopper pushes a very inebriated Bob Dylan into the cab, and maybe in a simple twist of fate, he lands on his back, face up, looking directly on my lap, looking directly in my eyes with those bluest of blue eyes. I have no idea what he's thinking. He's probably trying to figure out who I am. I've basically died and gone to heaven. Time and space disappear, and this secular Jew with socialist parents, I started having all these biblical references of Michelangelo's sculpture, the Pietà, where the Virgin Mary is cradling the Son of God in her lap, and I'm seeing a crown of thorns. Oh, where have you been, my blue-eyed son? Where have you been, my darling young one? And in the stillness of that moment, I mean, I was confused. I was tangled up in blue and probably seeking shelter from the storm. But in the stillness of the moment, where beauty walks a razor's edge, Bob Dylan lifted up his head, and he looked me right in the eye, and he got within 12 or 18 inches of my face. And he leaned in towards my ear, and he whispered, "Do you see stars when you come?" I'm 17 years old, and the Son of God was asking me this question. And I think I said, I think I'm seeing stars now. And then 2 weeks later, I say, I didn't realize I was coming. And the rest of the cab ride, I think I'm in a fog because Dylan looked me in the eye, sort of winked, and then got back, dropped down on my lap. And we go to the party. It's at Phil Ochs' apartment. And I spent a couple hours at the party. Basically, I'm sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, and 5 feet away from me is Bob Dylan leaning against the wall, and he's talking to 3 girls from NYU. And I keep pinching my thigh, is this really happening? And a couple of years later, I was in the Peace Corps. I was in a mud hut in the middle of West Africa. And I wrote to Bob, and I told him that I had the largest collection of Dylan tapes in all of sub-Saharan Africa. And I didn't get a response, and that's fine with me. I thought Bob was a national treasure then. I think he's a national treasure now. In 1976, Abby Hoffman committed suicide. In 1983, Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys committed suicide. And in 1989, Phil Ochs committed suicide. And Bob Dylan is still Bob Dylan. And there's something incredibly nostalgic about the past, that the innocence that is lost is always being lost. A living thing is a memory which acts. Eugene O'Neill said that. You can be part of my mutating memory if I can be part of your mutating memory. Scott said that. I find meaning in the shadows of forgotten ancestors and lovers and friends, and in those shadows, I see a beautifully misspent youth, where fun was the only currency that mattered, and now was the only tense allowed. I've got blisters on my fingers, but I still have bright coins in my pockets. So let's set the twilight reeling. Thank you.